Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. This is Naziaty Yaacob, your host for the podcast Talk Architecture. This is a part two discussion, come monologue of what I have to say with regard to what direction Malaysian schools of architecture need to take. Part two. Fresh from my experience attending a final crit at a private university in Kuala Lumpur yesterday, I have some ideas which I need to share, which is connected to what I've learned when I had discussions with different individuals with regard to architecture education. Now, the question is, what direction do Malaysian schools of architecture have to take? Why is this question being asked? Is there a problem with Malaysian schools of architecture? Aren't they doing well? Well, in our investigation and in many of the episodes of Talk Architecture, we've discussed this before. And you can also read many reports that you can come across locally or globally with regard to architecture education and the impact of technological advances and the development of aspects of technology that can speed up the design process or the construction process would impact how architects should be educated. Now, of course, try to refrain from using the word should. Don't want anyone to feel, that they're pressured into this. And who am I talking to? This is just a discussion. And maybe it's some thoughts or recollection of thoughts and summaries of thoughts which could allow us to process some feelings and some ideas that we had before. We have talents, and not one individual have all the talents. We have several individuals, and the future is being prepared right now as we talk. And what becomes the future is something that could be a surprise or could be inevitable, could be anything at all. We don't know because only God knows. So let us focus on the present and what are the mistakes that were done in the past. When we talk about mistakes, are these mistakes evident or do we consider them mistakes at all? That's why when I have some of the conversations, either with individuals or even monologues such as this, it's just opinions. And individuals out there listening could align to this opinion or could think that this opinion is not it's not acceptable or it does not have a justification. It's not based by statistics or facts, anything at all. I'm not trying to do a pitch here. I'm just trying to get discussions out. So what direction the word should comes out. What direction do Malaysian School of Architecture need to have? There was a publication and an effort by the Council of Head of School of Architecture in Malaysia to illustrate the direction of the Malaysian Schools of Architecture. Now, I simply can't remember, although I had attended some of these meetings. what were those directions. Such is the situation now that is happening, where technological advances are always changing and developing very rapidly. And if I were to think about myself as a student before and now, it's such a big difference. And the architect is left at his wake, or the architect joined the bandwagon, or the architect quickly chase the dream or chase what is needed to get payment and to be able to survive financially in order to live. Those are some of the scenarios that we have heard about how these things affect the architects and the designers that are related to the construction industry in particular. When we talk about this, it's to do with buildings that is going to be built for real and occupied by people, the users, and we get feedback on how to improve. Why is architecture practice different than architecture education? Why can't it be the same? Such were the questions that were asked by ARB, obviously, when they came up with the suggestion that do away with the first, second, third parts. I mean, just have one where the curriculum takes into account apprenticeship or the graduates practicing in architecture companies and being guided by individuals in the architecture company. So where does that idea come from? The idea came from that we're spending so much money in architecture school, but when the graduates come out, they don't really know anything. So the direction of architecture education, well, when we say they don't know anything just now, it's not a maybe an unfair statement. Obviously, they do know something, but if they do know something, but they're not confident about what do they know, the understanding, the realization of architecture and how they see architecture or they profess architecture is different than their future bosses, then something is wrong. That's why they have this idea of similar to what ARB is trying to do for architecture education. On the other hand, the other spectrum is architects since time immemorial, meaning that since the 18th century, the way that they have been trained and right to the Bauhaus and how the curriculum is set about for the architect to comprehensively understand everything and be able to design. And when any brief come their way to design a high-rise building, housing, to design any typology, be able to actually coordinate well with the contractor and other consultants, team members, such as the engineer and surveyor and the client. So one expects that this graduate coming out of architecture school be able to attend meetings almost immediately and take over from the architect or boss of the company and be able to do a good job nevertheless. Many architecture companies don't think so. In Malaysia, the architecture companies, the big ones, would separate the recent graduates in the architecture company itself to doing conceptual design and to be doing illustration schemes, so-called design studio, And only after a couple of years will they be considered to join the contract implementation team. That is, if they show enough understanding of architecture. Therefore, some architecture companies took graduates who graduated from certain schools, for example, with that enough of that competency, and trained them further in their offices. They can see that there must be a certain amount of competency for them to be a project architect or design architect or assisting the associate or be the architect that they expect them to be, where they could handle clients and contractors and consultants. That is the business of architectural practice. That is the how architecture practice is conducted. I mean, other than that, you decide to be a project manager or more to do with construction industry or a contractor, or because a contractor by right doesn't have to actually understand the whole of architecture. They just fix things like plumbing or tiling, or depending on what section of the building, and they have to be competent and know how to deal with finances and procuring materials, and if they are the main contractor, how they would manage huge equipment and how to deal with the site. I mean, depending the contractor. I mean, contractors are in a way specialized activities and work which understand the architecture drawings. Some of them they don't understand, so they just do what they wanted to do, but that's another story. What we're trying to say here is that when we are dealing with architecture education, do we consider all this? So when I had a summary of thoughts in part one, where architects should have a broad-based education and be able to critique, and students of architecture in Malaysia be able to compete globally if they are able to also do projects in architecture school that has to do with planning, also that has to do with master planning and urban design. And 5 years of architecture school and you want to do everything. So some of the protagonists that is for architecture practice, and the ease of students of architecture to enter architecture practice without having too much training to be done, as I illustrated earlier with some big companies. When we talk about smaller companies, they don't have the time to train these graduates. These graduates need to just jump in, and some of the projects are smaller buildings like bungalows, and they just have to deal with the client, individual clients, and they have to deal with the contractors that are not that good, or the contractors that are class bigger than class F, that deals with a certain amount of contracting work or costs. Maybe class D and above. So class A is the best class that deals with bigger projects, obviously. But for this group of architecture students that coming in working at smaller companies, they are expected to do everything from the beginning, maybe a couple of months break, but they just have to ease themselves in and be able to jump in the site meeting or the meeting with the client very early on, unlike the architects, the graduate architects in the bigger companies that I mentioned earlier, which goes to the design team and watched closely and monitored by the associates, so that you shall see someone who has the potential, but whether they could actually be dealing with a client in a couple of years' time. So there are two scenarios here. So what do the schools of architecture do? What's the direction of Malaysian architecture schools? The ability to be critical, ability or the awareness and understanding of architecture in a comprehensive manner, and being able to understand also what is the construction principles and a simple rule of thumb way of constructing, and understanding of materials, and doing a lot of case studies and much more theoretical understanding of architecture, because that is a university and it's not the real life yet. Then after that, there is a buffer zone of understanding architecture practice after going through 5 years of architecture education. So this buffer zone, a lot of, relearning, refreshing, or learning new things is happening to the architecture graduate. The culture of the office, how to manage other people, slowly understanding, taken into the wing of a senior architect. And if a graduate does not show any competency of being good enough for the architecture company, they might need to leave or be given a chance to go into another level of set of challenges for them to be more confident. The way I see it, architecture education could be anything. You can't really force students of architecture to imagine real practice unless it's real practice itself. So what ARB was trying to do was, if we don't want to cheat the industry, we don't want to cheat the parents, we don't want to cheat the stakeholders, then architecture education should do away with part 1, part 2, and part 3. And right after A levels or foundation courses, they go into architecture proper. Why should they learn too much on theory when this obsolete? Theory is obsolete because theory is subjective. Theory is to do with philosophy. Then whoever that they work with, the master, so-called master, or the boss of the architecture company in which they will do the architecture course, practically, that's the philosophy that they get. It is not fair to do so. That's the argument that I like to make. When after foundation course or even O levels in certain schools in Malaysia, for example, in certain schools of architecture, fresh from school or foundation course, the idea of exploring themselves is important. University, linking to the word universe, of finding their way, finding their sense of self. In terms of the younger person who's not yet matured, as we know, 25 years old is the maturing age of an individual. So these are before maturing. And in this universe called university, they find themselves. That's why broad-based education helps them to ask questions, to follow their interests, and to find out about the world apart from architecture. And architecture is about anything else and everything else. It's just that you have environmental science, structure, construction, material science, graphic design as part of it. But in the creative expressions, or the idea that this is the problem with society, because we think that creative expressions belong to the creative industry players or the creative people in our society, whereas creative expressions are to do with everyone. Everyone can be a creative. It's just that whether they had the time or the opportunity or the sense to do creativity. And creativity is not something that certain people are endowed with and certain people are not endowed with. But for those who wanting to be architects, is expressed more in terms of art, music, dance, creative journaling, cookery, or whatever that is creative expressions. Not just expressions, but creative expression, meaning their own work. They create their own work. They create musical scores, or they create a high level of art. It's not just, or even if they do crafts, arts and crafts, the crafts is being challenged. Everything is being challenged in terms of their creativity. So they create creative expressions that will help find themselves and find that architect in them. Now, it's something to do with what in the past architects were. It has to do with the arts and crafts movement. It has to do with the architects in the past, where they do lots of stuff. But they're actually clearly an architect. They can even do buildings. And what is this? The processes in the construction industry, the documentation takes over precedence in the architecture profession. It became that the architect profession, or the person who's in university need to understand about legal terms and legislation and regulation and documentation earlier on. That's why you have architectural practice or professional, there's a course, professional practice inserted in the Master of Architecture as a prerequisite. You have to know this, you have to do this. In part 3, you got to do this. You got to be examined like that. So the documentation part becomes something that is expected that the fresh graduate to know exactly what it is. But things change, and the documentation process depends on the local authority, and laws are constantly being updated. So the architect has to actually chase all these things to update oneself. And when you say you're a professional architect, you're actually somebody dealing with legal documentation and contracts and the management and day-to-day, almost like a project manager. And that's why people say that why you're not getting the students of architecture to be prepared for all that. What's the use of all these creative expressions and all these shenanigans with theory and philosophy? Why is that? Well, everybody knows, even the ones who are criticizing, they know that this is required of the universe, of a young person to discover themselves. So there's nothing wrong with an education that is broad-based, in which we allow the younger person to find out about themselves, to see what they like and make of it. It's the passion and the driven and the urgency and the motivation that they acquire during the session that drives them on to be that architect, whether it's in a big company or a small company. So this is just a summary of what has been discussed earlier, my experience going to Crete yesterday, getting along to getting the discussion ongoing as part of this podcast experience. And we will have eventually a discussion with different individuals. And we keep on having this subconsciously in our mind, these debates and this understanding, so as to refresh ourselves and asking questions. And everyone is involved. Every single listener, every everyone that has taken architecture as part of their course or liking architecture, even those who are not architects that are concerned about architecture. So thank you very much for listening and have a good day.